The winter of 1877 had already claimed 17 souls in Silver Creek by the time Ethan Cole rode out to check his northern fence line. He knew this because Doc Weatherby had told him 3 days prior, standing in the general store with snow still melting off his coat, his weathered face carrying the weight of every death he couldn't prevent. 17 people, the doctor had said, mostly the old and the sick. A few children who'd caught the fever that swept through town like God's own judgment. Ethan didn't think much about death anymore. It came when it came. A man just kept moving until it was his turn. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of relentless Montana blizzard that turned the world into a white void where directions ceased to exist and survival became a matter of instinct rather than knowledge. His horse, Copper, a 12-year-old mare with more sense than most men Ethan had known, moved through the drifts with patient determination. The animal understood what her rider sometimes forgot, that progress, even slow progress, was better than surrender. Ethan pulled his coat tighter against the wind. The cold out here wasn't something you felt, it was something you survived. Something that reminded you with every breath that nature didn't care about your plans or your pain or the fact that you'd buried everyone you'd ever loved in ground so frozen your hands bled for a week afterward. 4 years. 4 years since he dug those graves. 4 years since Sarah's fever had turned her skin the color of old paper. Since the twins, Daniel and Samuel, had held hands while death took them because they didn't want to die alone. 4 years of waking up in an empty house that still smelled like the family that used to fill it. 4 years of existing without living. Copper stumbled. The movement was slight, barely noticeable, but Ethan had learned to pay attention to the small thing. The mare's head jerked down, her front leg catching on something buried beneath the white. He dismounted, boots sinking knee-deep into powder that sparkled in the weak afternoon light, and brushed away enough snow to see what had tripped his horse. A hand. Gray and stiff, fingers curled like they were still reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Ethan had seen death before, had caused it during the war, had witnessed it in the years since. But there was something about those frozen fingers, the way they pointed forward with such desperate intent that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt since Sarah's last breath. He kept digging. The woman was maybe 30 years old, though the cold had transformed her face into a mask that could have belonged to anyone. She wore a thin dress, completely inadequate for this weather. No coat, no gloves, no hat. She died trying to reach a cabin that sat perhaps 50 yards ahead, half hidden by the curtain of falling snow. Her arms stretched toward it, frozen in mid-reach, as if death itself hadn't been enough to stop her from trying to get there. Ethan stood there for a long moment, looking at her. Then he looked at the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and weak, but rising nonetheless. Someone was alive in there. Someone this woman had been trying to save. He tied Copper to a skeletal tree and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. Could be anyone. Outlaws using an abandoned structure, squatters who might not appreciate company, trappers who'd shoot first and ask questions never. His hand found the familiar weight of the weapon as he pushed through the snow toward that weathered door. The crying hit him first. A child's voice, high and frightened, cutting through the wind like a knife through butter. Ethan kicked the door open, rifle raised, ready for anything except what he found. The smell nearly drove him back outside. Human waste, rotting food, sickness, and beneath it all, the sweet, sick scent of bodies pushed past their limits. But worse than the smell were the faces. 7 of them. Children. All of them. Ranging from what looked like a boy nearly grown to a tiny girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. They huddled together near a dying fire, wrapped in every scrap of cloth they could find, and they stared at him with eyes that had already seen too much. Eyes that had learned the hard way that adults couldn't be trusted, that help often came with conditions, and that sometimes no help came at all. One girl separated herself from the group. She couldn't have been more than 11 years old, with dark hair matted against a face made gaunt by hunger. Her left leg twisted at an angle that made Ethan's stomach turn, the kind of deformity that marked a child from birth and followed them through a life of whispered comments and casual cruelty. She dragged herself across the frozen floor using her arms, positioning her small body between Ethan and the other 6 children, like she could somehow protect them. Like she'd done this before. "Stay back," she said. Her voice cracked from disuse, but there was steel in it, a core of determination that reminded Ethan of soldiers he'd known during the war. The ones who refused to quit, even when quitting was the only sensible option. "I don't know who you are, but these children are under my protection." Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, making sure she could see every movement. "Easy there, miss. I'm not here to hurt anyone." "That's what the last one said." The girl's gray eyes never left his face, searching for the lie she'd learned to expect from grown folks. "Right before they took what little food we had left and rode off." Jesus Christ. Someone had robbed them, robbed a bunch of starving children in the middle of a blizzard and left them to die. "My name's Ethan Cole," he said, keeping his voice calm the way he'd learned to talk to spooked horses. "I have a ranch about 15 miles south of here. I found a woman outside, frozen. Was she with your group?" Something flickered across the girl's face. Pain so deep it looked almost physical, the kind of hurt that went beyond tears into a place where grief became a weight you carried in your bones. "Mrs. Thornton," she said. "She went for help 2 days ago. We told her to wait for the storm to break, but she said the little ones couldn't last much longer without food." "She didn't make it," Ethan said. "I'm sorry." The girl absorbed this information with a stillness that worried him more than tears would have. She'd already learned not to cry. At 11 years old, she'd already learned that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. "That makes 3 dead now," she said, her voice matter-of-fact in a way that made Ethan's chest ache. "Mr. Patterson froze in his sleep last week." His wife Mary died of fever 3 days later. "Now, Mrs. Thornton, what about your folks?" "Dead. Everyone's folks are dead." She gestured at the huddled children behind her, each one watching the exchange with varying degrees of hope and terror. "That's why we're here, and they're not." Ethan took a careful step closer, and the girl immediately tensed, her thin body coiling like a spring ready to snap. He stopped, raising his hand slightly. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "Any of you. I give you my word." "Words don't mean much out here, mister." "No," he said. "I suppose they don't." He crouched down, bringing himself closer to her level. This close, he could see how badly she was shaking, how blue her lips had become, the way her eyes kept flickering to the other children like she was calculating how to get them out if this stranger turned dangerous. "But I've got a warm ranch with food and a fire that doesn't go out. I've got a partner named Rafe who makes the best stew you ever tasted, and I've got room enough for 7 children who need a place to stay. Why would you help us?" The question cut him somewhere deep, in a place he'd thought had scarred over years ago. No child should have to ask that question. No child should have to doubt that adults would help them when they needed it most. "Because my boys would have been about your age if they'd lived," he said. The words came out before he could stop them, before he could build the walls back up that usually kept people from seeing inside. He hadn't talked about Daniel and Samuel to anyone in years. "And because I couldn't live with myself if I rode past and let you die." The girl studied him for a long moment, Behind her, the other children stirred. A red-haired girl started crying softly, and a broad-shouldered boy moved to comfort her. An older girl with features that suggested mixed heritage glared at Ethan with open hostility. "My name's Grace," the girl with the twisted leg finally said. "Grace Morgan."
"And if you're lying about any of this, I swear to God, I'll find a way to make you regret it." Despite everything, despite the cold and the death and the weight of what he was taking on, Ethan felt something like respect stir in his chest. "Fair enough, Miss Morgan. Now can we get you and these young ones somewhere warm before we all freeze to death?" Grace turned to look at the group behind her. Ethan watched her take stock of each child, assessing their condition with eyes too old for her face. The kind of eyes that had been forced to make life and death decisions when they should have been worrying about dolls and games. "Danny," she said to the broad-shouldered boy, "can you walk?" The boy, maybe 14, with the build of someone who'd done hard labor, nodded. "I can carry one of the little ones too if needed." "Good. You take Alice. She hasn't walked in 2 days." Grace pointed to the smallest girl, the one who'd pressed herself into the corner and watched everything with huge, terrified eyes. She hadn't made a sound since Ethan had entered, hadn't reacted to anything at all. The red-haired girl wiped her tears. "I can walk, Grace. I'm not a baby." "I know you're not, Bridget." Grace's voice softened slightly. "But I need you to help the boys. Can you do that?" 3 boys ranging in age from about 7 to 10 huddled together. One of them, a dark-skinned child who couldn't have been more than 7, kept his eyes fixed on Ethan with an expression of deep distrust. Ethan recognized that look. He'd seen it on former slaves who'd learned the hard way that freedom didn't always mean safety. "What about Lily?" Danny asked, gesturing to the older girl who sat apart from the others, the one with mixed heritage who glared at Ethan with barely contained fury. "I don't need help from anyone," Lily said. Her voice was sharp as broken glass. "Speak not from some stranger who probably just wants something from us." "Lily," Grace's tone carried a warning. "He's our best chance, maybe our only chance." "That's what they said about the wagon train. Look how that turned out. The wagon train left us. This man came looking." Grace turned back to Ethan, her gray eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. "We'll come with you, Mr. Cole. But I need to know one thing first." "Ask it." "That woman outside, Mrs. Thornton. She died trying to save us. Will you bury her proper, with words and everything?" The request hit Ethan harder than he'd expected. This child, starving and frozen and responsible for 6 other lives, wanted to make sure a dead woman got a proper burial before she'd agreed to save herself. "I'll bury her proper," he promised. "Soon as the ground thaws enough to dig. Until then, I'll make sure the animals don't get to her." Grace nodded once, satisfied. Then she tried to stand. Her twisted leg buckled immediately, and she would have fallen if Ethan hadn't caught her. She weighed almost nothing, skin and bones wrapped in determination that burned brighter than the dying fire. "I can walk," she insisted, even as her body betrayed her. "I just need a moment." "I'm sure you can," Ethan said, "but there's no shame in accepting help when you need it." He looked at the other children who were watching the exchange with varying degrees of fear and hope. "That goes for all of you. You've been taking care of yourselves for too long. Time to let someone else carry the weight for a while." "We don't know you," Lily said, but some of the hostility had faded from her voice. "We don't know anything about you except what you've told us." "That's true," Ethan said. "You'll have to decide if I'm worth trusting." He shifted Grace's weight in his arms and moved toward the door. "But I figure you can make that decision somewhere warm, with food in your bellies." "The alternative is staying here and freezing to death." He said it bluntly, without trying to soften the reality. These children had been through too much for gentle lies. They deserved honesty, even when it was harsh. "He's right," Danny said, stepping forward with the tiny girl Alice cradled against his chest. She hadn't moved or made a sound the entire time. "We can't stay here. The fire's almost out and there's no more wood. Another night and we're all dead." One by one, the children began to move toward the door. The red-haired girl, Bridget, held hands with a boy who muttered prayers in what sounded like Polish. A thin boy with skeptical eyes walked alone, his face set in lines of bitter wariness. The youngest boy, the one with dark skin and ancient eyes, stayed close to the walls, watching Ethan like a rabbit watches a hawk. Lily was the last to move. She stopped in front of Ethan before stepping outside, her mixed heritage features set in an expression of fierce determination. "If you hurt any of them," she said quietly, "I'll kill you. I don't care how big you are or how many guns you have. I'll find a way." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "If I hurt any of them, I'll deserve it." The blizzard had weakened slightly by the time they emerged, but the cold was still brutal, the kind that turned exposed skin white in minutes and stole the breath from your lungs. Ethan whistled for Copper, who came trudging through the drifts with the patience of a horse who'd seen everything and feared nothing. 7 of you, 1 horse, Ethan calculated quickly. The littlest ones will ride. Everyone else walks. We move slow. We move together. And we stop for no one. Understood? The children nodded, their faces pale but determined. "Grace, you're on Copper with Alice and Bridget. Danny, you keep the boys close. Lily, you're with me at the front." "I can walk," Grace protested. "My leg isn't that bad." "Your leg is exactly that bad, and we both know it." Ethan lifted her onto the horse before she could argue further, then handed up Alice, who still hadn't spoken or reacted to anything. Bridget climbed up behind them, wrapping her arms around Grace's waist for warmth and stability. 15 miles, the skeptical boy said flatly. "In this weather, half of us will be dead before we get there." "No one's dying today," Ethan said, taking point to break trail through the snow. "Not on my watch." They moved in silence for the first hour. Ethan kept a brutal pace, knowing that stopping meant death. The children stumbled and fell, picked themselves up, kept moving. No complaints, no crying. They'd already learned that tears froze on your face out here. It was the youngest boy who spoke first, his small voice nearly lost in the wind. "Mister," he said, "that lady back there, Mrs. Thornton, she wasn't our mama or nothing. She was just a stranger who got stuck with us when everyone else died." "Is that so?" "She gave us her food for 3 days. Said she wasn't hungry, but we knew she was lying." The boy's dark eyes met Ethan's, searching for something. "She died for us, and she didn't even know us." Ethan thought about Sarah, who'd spent her last weeks of life making sure everything was in order for him after she was gone. Thought about his boys, who'd held hands while the fever took them because they didn't want to die alone. "Sometimes strangers are the only family we get," he said finally. "Doesn't make them less important. Just makes them different." The boy seemed to consider this. "You're a stranger too." "I am. But you stopped." "I did." "Why?" It was the same question Grace had asked, and Ethan still didn't have a good answer. Because he'd lost too much already and couldn't stand to lose more, even if the loss belonged to someone else. Because those 7 faces had reminded him of every child he'd failed to save, including his own. Because something in Grace's fierce gray eyes had grabbed hold of something in his chest and wouldn't let go. "Because I was tired of riding past," he said. "Tired of pretending other people's pain wasn't my problem. Tired of being the kind of man who looks away. The boy walked in silence for a while after that. Then so quietly, Ethan almost missed it. He said, "My mama said there were good white folks out there. Said I just had to wait long enough to find them. Your mama was a smart woman. She's dead now. Daddy too. Everyone's dead. I know, son. I'm sorry. It's not your fault." The boy's voice was matter-of-fact in the way only a child's could be. "You didn't kill them. You're just the one who showed up after." They reached the ranch just as darkness was falling. Ethan's legs had gone numb hours ago, and he was pretty sure at least 2 of the children had frostbite on their fingers. But they were alive, all 7 of them, still breathing, still moving, still fighting. Rafael Mendoza met them at the door, his weathered face cycling through surprise, concern, and determination in rapid succession. "Madre de Dios," he breathed, taking in the parade of frozen children. "Ethan, what in God's name?" "Found them in an abandoned cabin about 15 miles north. Their whole wagon train died or ran off. They've been alone for weeks." Rafe didn't ask any more questions. He simply stepped back and held the door wide. "Come in, little ones. Come in. The fire is warm and the stew is hot." His accent thickened with emotion as he ushered them inside. "You are safe now. You are all safe." Grace was the last to enter. She'd insisted on walking the final 100 yards, using a stick as a makeshift crutch, refusing to be carried across the threshold like an invalid. Ethan watched her limp into his home, this child who'd been left to die twice over, and still hadn't learned to give up. She turned at the doorway and looked at him with those ancient gray eyes that had seen more than any 11-year-old should ever have to witness. "Thank you," she said simply, "for stopping. Thank me when you've had something to eat and a good night's sleep. We've still got a long way to go." "I know." Grace's gaze swept across the ranch house, taking in the sturdy walls and the roaring fire and the pot of stew bubbling on the stove. "But this is more than we've had in a long time. This is a start." Yes, Ethan thought as he followed her inside and closed the door against the howling wind. This was a start. The question was whether any of them had enough left to see it through to the end. The children gathered around the fire like moths to a flame, their frozen bodies slowly thawing as Rafe ladled out bowl after bowl of rabbit stew. Most of them ate like they hadn't seen food in weeks, which Ethan realized was probably closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. Potatoes and carrots and chunks of meat disappeared so fast he wondered if they even tasted it, or if hunger had reduced eating to nothing more than desperate reflex. All except the smallest girl. Alice sat motionless, staring at the bowl in her hands like she'd forgotten what to do with it. 6 years old, maybe younger, with blonde hair that might have been pretty once, and blue eyes that looked at everything and saw nothing. She hadn't spoken since Ethan found them, hadn't reacted to anything at all, just sat there, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Grace noticed his attention. She stopped talking after her mama died, she whispered, her voice low enough that the other children wouldn't hear. Watched it happen. Watched the fever take her whole family, one by one, and she was the only one left. How long ago? 6 weeks, maybe 7? We've all lost track of time. Grace took a careful spoonful of stew, savoring it like it was the finest meal she'd ever tasted. The doctor on the wagon train said it was shock. Said she might start talking again when she felt safe, but I don't think she's felt safe since. Ethan looked at the tiny girl with her empty eyes and untouched bowl. 6 years old and already hollowed out by loss. He knew that feeling, had lived with it for 4 years after Sarah and the boys died. The way the world kept turning, even when your world had stopped. The way people expected you to keep breathing, even when breathing felt like betrayal.
Give her time, he said. Safety takes a while to believe in. That's what I keep telling her. Grace glanced at him sideways, those two old eyes seeing more than he wanted them to see. You lost children, didn't you? I can see it in how you look at us. The question should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like recognition. One broken soul seeing another across the divide that separated the living from the merely surviving. Twin boys, he said. Daniel and Thomas.
They were 6 when the fever took them. Same age as Alice. Same age as Alice. Grace was quiet for a moment, her thin fingers wrapped around the bowl like she was trying to absorb its warmth through skin and bone. My parents died when I was 8. Fever got them too. The wagon train was supposed to take me to my aunt in Oregon, but then people started getting sick and everything fell apart. Your leg, Ethan said. Were you born with it? Yes. She said it without shame or self-pity. Just fact, the way another child might say they had brown hair or blue eyes. The wagon master said I was slowing everyone down. Said they couldn't afford to wait for a crippled girl who couldn't walk right. The wagon master was a damn fool. A ghost of a smile touched Grace's lips, there and gone so fast he almost missed it. That's what Mrs. Thornton said. She stayed behind with us when everyone else left. Said she'd rather die with children who needed her than live with people who'd abandoned them. Ethan thought about the frozen body still lying in the snow, waiting for a burial she'd more than earned. She was a good woman. She was the best woman. Grace's voice cracked slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown since the cabin. She died because of us. Because we weren't worth saving to anyone else. That's not true. Isn't it? Grace's gray eyes had gone hard again, defensive walls slamming back into place. 7 children, Mr. Cole. One of us can't walk right. One won't speak. One has skin that makes people want to hurt him. We're not the kind of orphans anyone wants to adopt. We're the kind they ship off to workhouses and factories because nobody cares what happens to us. The bitter accuracy of her words hit Ethan like a fist to the gut. He'd seen those workhouses during the war, seen the children who emerged from them broken in body and spirit, seen the factories that chewed up young lives and spit out whatever remained when profit had been extracted from innocence. You're not going to any workhouse, he said. None of you.
How can you promise that? Grace set down her bowl, appetite apparently gone despite the hunger that hollowed out her cheeks. You don't even know us. By tomorrow you might decide we're too much trouble and send us on our way.
I won't. Everyone says that at first.
Her voice carried the weight of experience, of promises broken so many times that hope itself had become dangerous. Then they see how much work we are, how much food we eat, how much space we take up, and suddenly the promises don't matter anymore. Ethan didn't have an answer for that. She was right to be suspicious, right to doubt his intentions. He was a stranger who'd shown up at the worst moment of her life, and she had no reason to believe he was any different from the others who'd abandoned her. So instead of arguing, he simply said, "Get some sleep, Miss Morgan. We can talk more in the morning."
Grace hesitated, clearly wanting to push further, but exhaustion won out over suspicion, and she finally nodded. "The other children," she said. "They need proper beds. Alice needs to be somewhere warm, and Isaiah keeps looking at the door like he's planning to run. Rafe's setting up the storage house. There are enough beds for everyone. I should help. You should rest. That leg needs looking at, and you won't do anyone any good if you collapse from exhaustion." Grace opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. For just a moment she looked like what she was, a frightened 11-year-old girl who'd been carrying the weight of 6 lives on shoulders too thin to bear it. "Okay,"
she said quietly. "But if anything happens, if anyone needs me, I'll wake you, I promise." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching for the lie she'd learned to expect from adults. When she didn't find it, something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of
The first crack in walls built from abandonment and disappointment. "Good night, Mr. Cole. Good night, Miss Morgan." He watched her limp toward the storage house that Rafe had converted into a temporary bunk room, that twisted leg dragging through snow she'd already crossed once today. Tomorrow he'd need to find her a proper crutch, something better than the stick she was using. Tonight he just needed everyone to survive. Rafe appeared at his elbow, having finished settling the younger children into their beds. "7 of them," he said quietly. "And winter barely half over." "I know. We barely have enough food for the 2 of us until spring. Now there are 9 mouths to feed." "I know that too. The town won't like this. A single man taking in children. People will talk." Ethan turned to face his old friend, his expression set in lines of determination that Rafe had seen before, usually right before Ethan did something that would cause them both a world of trouble. "Let them talk. Those children needed help. I helped them. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." Rafe was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, the sound carrying years of resignation to Ethan Cole's particular brand of stubborn righteousness. "I'll need to go to town for supplies. More blankets, more food, medicine if Doc Weatherby has any to spare." "Thank you, Rafe." "Don't thank me yet." Rafe glanced toward the storage house where 7 children were settling into beds for the first time in weeks. "Those little ones, they're not just hungry and cold. They're broken, Ethan. Some in ways that food and warmth won't fix." "I know. And that girl, Grace, she's been holding them together through sheer will. When she finally lets go, when she finally lets herself feel everything she's been pushing down." "I know." Ethan's voice was heavy with understanding. "I've been there, remember? After Sarah and the boys. You're the one who pulled me back. That was different." You were a grown man with years of living behind you. These are children who've already seen more death than most adults. "Maybe not," Ethan said. "But we can give them a place to heal. We can show them that not everyone will abandon them." He looked up at the night sky, where stars had finally emerged now that the storm had passed. "And maybe, just maybe, we can teach them that being different doesn't mean being worthless." Rafe followed his gaze to the heavens. "You're thinking about more than just food and shelter. I'm thinking about those factories back east, the ones that buy children from orphan trains and work them until they break." Ethan's jaw tightened with barely contained anger. "I'm thinking about every child I've ever heard about who disappeared into those places and never came out. And I'm thinking that if I can save 7 of them from that fate, then maybe all the things I've lost weren't for nothing." The words hung in the cold air between them. A confession and a promise and a prayer all wrapped together. Rafe didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He'd known Ethan long enough to recognize when the man had made up his mind about something. Finally, he said, "We're going to need more than good intentions. We're going to need help. I know. Mrs. Caldwell has been looking for a cause to support since her sons died in the war. And Doc Weatherby owes me for that business with the rustlers last fall." "And the town council?" Rafe asked. "Sheriff Dalton?" Ethan's expression darkened at the mention of the sheriff. Marcus Dalton had hated him for 8 years, ever since they'd both courted the same woman and Ethan had won.
The fact that Sarah had died anyway hadn't softened Dalton's grudge one bit. If anything, it seemed to have made the man's hatred burn hotter, as if Ethan had somehow cheated by losing what Dalton had wanted. The sheriff can go to hell.
I've got legal right to take in orphans if I want. Nothing in the territorial law says otherwise. Legal right and community acceptance aren't the same thing. They'll have to be good enough. Ethan turned toward the house, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the miles he'd walked today. Get some sleep, Rafe. Tomorrow we start building something new. He paused at the door, looking back at the storage house one more time. Through the window he could see Grace sitting up in bed, watching over the other children as they slept. Still on guard. Still protecting them even though protection was supposed to be his job now. She caught his eye across the darkness and held it for a moment. Then slowly, she lay down and closed her eyes. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a start. And sometimes, Ethan thought as he finally went inside, a start was all you needed. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment and small discoveries. Ethan woke before dawn each morning to find Grace already up, checking on the other children, making sure the fire hadn't died overnight, counting heads like she expected someone to have vanished in the darkness. You don't have to do that anymore, he told her on the third morning, finding her limping between beds at 4 o'clock. That's my job now. Old habits. Grace didn't look at him, her attention focused on making sure each child was still breathing, still warm, still there. I've been counting heads for 6 weeks. Hard to stop. Try. She finally met his eyes, and he saw the dark circles beneath them, the tremor in her hands that came from running on fear and willpower for too long. What if I stop and something happens? What if I let my guard down and someone gets hurt? Then we deal with it together. That's what family does. We're not family. We're strangers you found in a cabin. Family's got nothing to do with blood, Miss Morgan. It's got to do with showing up, with staying when things get hard. Ethan crouched down to her level, ignoring the protest in his knees. I'm not asking you to trust me yet. I'm asking you to rest. Let someone else carry the weight for a while. Grace's lip trembled just for a second before she forced it still. I don't know how. Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time. She didn't agree, but she also didn't argue when he guided her back to her bed and pulled the blanket up to her chin. And when he checked on her an hour later, she was finally sleeping, her face relaxed for the first time since he'd met her. The other children presented their own challenges, their own walls built from different kinds of pain. Danny, the oldest boy at 14, threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He was up before Ethan, chopping wood, feeding animals, mending fences that didn't need mending. Like he was trying to prove something. Like he was trying to earn the right to breathe. On the fourth day, Ethan found him collapsed from exhaustion in the barn. You don't have to earn your keep, Ethan told him. You're not a hired hand. You're a child. I'm 14. Danny's voice was defensive, his pride wounded. Old enough to work. Old enough to pull my weight. Old enough to work, sure, but not old enough to work yourself to death. Ethan sat down on a hay bale, giving the boy space. What are you running from, son? I'm not running from anything. Then what are you running toward? Danny was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with the weight of guilt he'd been carrying. I was supposed to protect them. My pa, before he died, he made me promise. Said I was the man of the family now. Said I had to keep everyone safe. And you feel like you failed. I did fail. Danny's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white.
People died. Mrs. Thornton died. And I couldn't do anything to stop it. Mrs. Thornton died trying to get help for all of you.
That wasn't your failure. That was her choice. I should have gone instead. I'm stronger. I could have made it. Maybe. Or maybe you would have frozen to death too, and those 6 children would have lost their only protection. Ethan leaned forward, making sure the boy could see his face. You kept them alive, Danny. For 6 weeks in the worst winter Montana's seen in 20 years. You kept 6 children alive. That's not failure. That's a miracle. Danny's shoulders shook, and for a moment Ethan thought he might cry. But the boy had been holding himself together for too long. The tears wouldn't come. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I don't know how to stop, Danny admitted. I don't know how to just be a kid again. Neither do I. Ethan stood, offering his hand. But I figure we can learn together. You, me, and all those other children who forgot what childhood feels like. Danny took his hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. It wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of trust. Lily was harder to reach. The 12-year-old girl with Chinese features and American fury had built walls so high Ethan couldn't see over them. She refused to speak to him directly, refused to acknowledge his presence unless absolutely necessary, and spent most of her time glaring at anyone who came too close. She's not always like this, Bridget explained one afternoon, her Irish lilt making the words sound almost musical. Before everything happened, she used to smile, used to tell jokes and make everyone laugh. What happened? People happened. Bridget's cheerful face darkened. The men on the wagon train, they said mean things about her mama. Called her names I'm not supposed to repeat. Said Lily was an abomination because her blood was mixed. And Lily heard all this. Lily heard everything. And when her mama got sick, nobody would help. They said it was God's punishment for her mama's sin. Bridget's eyes filled with tears. Her mama died alone in a tent because nobody would sit with her except Lily. Ethan found Lily behind the barn that evening, throwing rocks at a tree with violent precision. Each throw carried the weight of fury she had no other way to express. "Good arm," he said, keeping his distance. Lily didn't respond, just threw another rock, harder this time. "I knew a soldier once who could throw like that. Confederate sniper picked him off at Antietam before he could show the world what he could do with a proper baseball. Still nothing. Your mama must have been a strong woman, raising a daughter in a world that didn't want her." Lily's hand froze mid-throw. "Don't talk about my mama." "Why not?" "Because you don't know her. You don't know anything about her. I know she raised a daughter who protected 6 other children when no one else would. I know she raised someone brave enough to stand up to a stranger twice her size." Ethan took a careful step closer. "I know she'd be proud of you." The rock dropped from Lily's hand. Her shoulders began to shake. "They let her die." The words came out broken, shattered. "They just let her die because she wasn't good enough for them. Because I wasn't good enough." "Listen to me." Ethan's voice was firm but gentle. "What those people did, what they said, that was about them. Their fear, their hatred, their small-minded cruelty. It had nothing to do with you or your mother." "Then why does it hurt so much?" "Because words have power, especially when they come from people who should know better. But here's the truth, Lily. The truth they didn't want you to know." He crouched down, meeting her eyes. "You're not an abomination. You're not a mistake. You're a child of 2 cultures, and that makes you twice as strong, twice as valuable, twice as important to this world." Lily stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Nobody's ever said that to me before."
Then everyone you've met before was a fool.
For the first time since Ethan had found them, Lily's face softened. Not a smile, not yet, but something close. The first crack in walls that had taken years of cruelty to build. "I still don't trust you," she said. "I know. But maybe you could hate me a little less." "Maybe." She picked up another rock, tested its weight. "We'll see." But news from town brought darker tidings. On the 5th day, Rafe returned from Silver Creek with supplies and information that made Ethan's stomach drop. "People are talking," Rafe said quietly after the children had gone to bed. "About you. About the children. About what kind of man takes in 7 orphans in the middle of winter. Let them talk. It's more than talk." Rafe's expression was grim. "Sheriff Dalton has been asking questions, saying he's concerned about the children's welfare, saying maybe someone should check to make sure they're being properly cared for. Dalton doesn't give a damn about those children. He just wants to cause me trouble." "I know, but he's the law in this territory. If he decides to make an official inquiry, then he'll find 7 children who are fed, clothed, warm, and safe, which is more than they had before I found them." Rafe hesitated. "There's something else." "What?" "A man came to town asking about abandoned children. Well-dressed, Eastern accent. Said he represented an organization that places orphans with good families." Ethan went still. "What kind of organization?" "He didn't say, but he had papers, official-looking ones, and he seemed very interested when someone mentioned the children at your ranch." The memory of Grace's words echoed in Ethan's mind. "We're not the kind of orphans anyone wants to adopt. We're the kind they ship off to workhouses and factories." "Did you get his name?" "Grayson. Silas Grayson." Ethan had never heard the name before, but something about it made his skin crawl. Men in fine suits didn't come to remote Montana territories out of the goodness of their hearts. They came because there was profit to be made. "Keep your ears open," he told Rafe, "and don't let any of the children go into town without one of us with them." "You think this man is dangerous?" "I think anyone who makes money off orphans isn't someone I want anywhere near those kids." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the kitchen with his rifle across his lap, watching the snow fall outside the window and thinking about all the ways the world could take away everything he was trying to build. The children trusted him now. Not completely, not yet, but enough to let their guards down. Enough to laugh at Rafe's jokes and ask questions about the ranch and start talking about what they wanted to be when they grew up. And now some stranger in a fancy suit was asking questions about them. Not while I'm breathing, Ethan thought. Not while there's a single breath left in my body. He checked on the children at midnight, moving quietly between beds. Danny slept with his fists clenched, still fighting even in his dreams. Lily had kicked off her covers and lay sprawled like she was ready to spring up at the first sign of danger. Noah was curled into a ball, making himself as small as possible. Anton snored softly, a sound that made Bridget giggle every morning. Isaiah had positioned himself closest to the door, his eyes flickering open briefly when Ethan entered, before closing again when he recognized who it was. And Alice lay awake, staring at the ceiling with those empty blue eyes. Ethan sat down beside her bed, not speaking, just present. After a long moment, Alice turned to look at him. For the first time since the cabin, something flickered in her gaze. Not quite awareness, not quite hope, but something. Then she did something she hadn't done since her family died. She reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his calloused palm, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. Ethan felt his throat tighten.
felt tears burning behind his eyes that he hadn't let fall since Sarah died. "You're safe," he whispered. "Whatever happens, you're safe." Alice didn't speak, couldn't speak yet, but she squeezed his hand, and in that grip, Ethan felt the first fragile threads of trust beginning to form. The morning of the 10th day dawned cold and clear, bringing with it a visitor that would change everything. Silas Grayson arrived in a black carriage pulled by horses too fine for Montana territory, the kind of vehicle that announced wealth and power before its occupant even stepped down. He was perhaps 46 years old, wearing a coat that cost more than most ranchers made in a year, and his smile had the practiced warmth of a man who'd learned to fake sincerity.
Ethan met him in the yard with his rifle in hand, but not raised. Not yet. 7 children watched from the window, their faces pressed against the glass, sensing danger the way animals sense storms. "Mr. Cole, I presume?" Grayson stepped down from the carriage, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. "I've heard quite a lot about you. Can't say the same. What brings you to my ranch?" "Concern, Mr. Cole. Pure humanitarian concern." Grayson's eyes scanned the property, lingering on the storage house where the children slept. "Word has reached my organization that you've taken in a number of orphan children. Admirable. Truly admirable. But I must ask, are you equipped to provide for them properly? They're fed, they're warm, they're safe. That's more than they had before. Of course, of course. But surely you understand that children need more than basic survival." Grayson pulled a leather folder from his coat. They need education, structure, the guidance of proper institutions designed for their care. I represent the Eastern Children's Placement Bureau. We specialize in placing orphans with suitable families who can provide everything they need. Suitable families. Ethan's voice was flat. Families who have been thoroughly vetted. Families with resources and stability. Grayson opened the folder, revealing documents covered in stamps and signatures. "We've placed over 3,000 children in the past 5 years alone, given them opportunities they never would have had otherwise." "What kind of opportunities?" "Employment, training, the chance to become productive members of society." Grayson's smile never wavered. "Many of our children go on to work in manufacturing, textiles, various industries that are always in need of eager young hands." There it was, the truth beneath the polished words. Eager young hands. Children sold into factory labor, worked until they broke, discarded when they were no longer useful. "I think you should leave now, Mr. Grayson. I understand your hesitation. Truly, I do. You've grown attached to these children. That's natural." Grayson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But consider their futures, Mr. Cole. What can you offer them here? A life of ranching, manual labor, limited prospects in a remote territory. I can offer them a home, a family, people who give a damn whether they live or die. Sentiment is admirable, but it doesn't fill bellies or build futures." Grayson tucked the folder back into his coat. "I'll leave you my card. When you realize you're in over your head, and you will, please don't hesitate to contact me. The offer will remain open." He climbed back into his carriage, but paused before taking the reins. "One more thing, Mr. Cole. I noticed some of the children you've taken in are rather unusual. A mixed-race girl, a colored boy, a cripple." His smile turned cold. "These children are particularly difficult to place with traditional families. They tend to end up in less desirable situations. Factories, workhouses, institutions that aren't as particular about the condition of their charges." "Is that a threat?" "Merely an observation. Good day, Mr. Cole."
Ethan watched the carriage disappear down the road, his hand shaking with barely contained rage. When he turned back toward the house, Grace was standing on the porch, her face pale. "He's going to try to take us," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's going to try. How can you stop him?" "I don't know yet, but I will." That afternoon, Grace made a proposal that surprised him. "We're not helpless," she said, gathering the older children around the kitchen table. "We can help. Bridget remembers everything she hears. Noah can read legal documents. Danny knows how to move without being seen. Let us gather information." Ethan wanted to refuse.
Wanted to protect them from danger, the way he hadn't been able to protect his own sons. But Grace was right. These weren't helpless victims. They were survivors who'd kept themselves alive through intelligence and determination. "Rafe goes with you," he said finally. "Anywhere in town, anytime, he's there. And if anything feels wrong, you get out immediately." Agreed. The next day, Rafe took Grace, Danny, and Noah into Silver Creek on the pretense of buying supplies. They returned with information that confirmed Ethan's worst fears. "Grayson's been in town for a week," Grace reported, her expression grim. "He's already bought 3 children from desperate families, $20 each, more if they're healthy and strong." $20, more than many families saw in a year. The temptation would be overwhelming for people already struggling to survive. "What about the sheriff?" Ethan asked. "He's definitely working with Grayson." Noah spoke up, his voice bitter. "We saw them drinking together at the saloon. When they noticed us watching, Sheriff Dalton gave us this look like we were livestock he was sizing up for market." "He mentioned you specifically," Danny added. "Said something about how you couldn't keep 8 children hidden forever, how eventually you'd slip up, and when you did, he'd be ready." So it was personal. Dalton wasn't just helping Grayson out of greed. He was using this situation to finally destroy the man he'd hated for 8 years. "There's something else," Grace said, her voice uncertain. "We met someone. A woman who might be able to help." "Who?" "Mrs. Catherine Ashford." Ethan knew that name. Catherine Ashford was the wealthiest widow in the territory, a woman who'd lost her husband and 3 sons to war and disease, but had refused to be broken by grief. She was also one of the few people in Silver Creek who'd never seemed to care about Ethan's past or his ongoing feud with the sheriff. "What did she say?"
Grace pulled a folded paper from her coat. "She wants to meet with you. Tonight, if possible." Catherine Ashford received Ethan in a sitting room that spoke of old money and refined taste. She was perhaps 61 years old, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. "Mr. Cole, I've heard a great deal about you." She gestured to a chair. "Most of it unflattering, I imagine." "On the contrary. Sheriff Dalton has been trying to destroy your reputation for years, which tells me you must be doing something right." She poured tea with steady hands. "We have much to discuss. Your sister in Wyoming. Grace said she lost children to Grayson's organization. 2 nephews taken under the pretense of finding them suitable homes." Catherine's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "We later learned they were shipped to a textile mill in Massachusetts. One died in a factory fire."
"The other escaped and eventually made his way back. But he was broken, scarred in body and spirit. He hanged himself 6 months later."
"I'm sorry."
"So am I. Sorry and angry and determined to ensure it doesn't happen to anyone else."
She leaned forward. "I've been fighting Grayson and his partners for 3 years, Mr. Cole. I've hired lawyers, investigators, journalists. I've accumulated evidence of their crimes, testimony from survivors, Financial records showing how much they profit from each child they sell. Why haven't you stopped them? Because they have protection. Powerful men in Washington who benefit from cheap child labor. Judges who rule in their favor regardless of evidence. Local law enforcement who are either bribed or threatened into compliance. Her eyes met his. Sheriff Dalton has been receiving payments from Grayson's organization for over a year. $20 a month deposited into an account in Helena. You have proof of this? I have proof of many things.
What I don't have is someone willing to act on it. She stood, moving to a desk in the corner. The territorial governor is an honest man, but he's in Helena, and by the time word reaches him, children have already been shipped east. The federal marshals are spread too thin to investigate every suspicious custody transfer, and the newspapers are reluctant to print stories that might anger their wealthy advertisers. So what do you suggest? Catherine returned with a thick folder. I suggest we make it impossible for Grayson to operate here. Legally, publicly, and if necessary by force. What's in that folder? Everything I've gathered over 3 years. Testimony, photographs, financial records. Enough to destroy Grayson's reputation and possibly send him to prison if we can get it in front of the right people. And who are the right people? There's a federal prosecutor in Denver who's been building a case against child trafficking operations in the Western Territories. Catherine handed him the folder.
His name is James Thornton. He's the one who helped my family try to recover my nephews, even though we ultimately failed. If you can get this evidence to him, along with your testimony about Grayson's activities here, it might be enough to finally bring the organization down. Ethan took the folder, feeling its weight. 3 years of work. Grief transformed into determination. A woman who'd lost everything, fighting to save children she'd never meet. Why are you trusting me with this? Because you're the only one who's taken action. The only one who looked at 7 abandoned children and saw human beings worth saving instead of problems to be managed. Catherine's voice softened. And because my sons would have been about your age if they'd lived. I'd like to think they would have been the kind of men who stopped for children in need. I'll get this to Thornton, whatever it takes. Be careful. Grayson has already realized you're a threat.
He'll be watching you, looking for any weakness to exploit. He won't find one. Everyone has weaknesses, Mr. Cole. The trick is not letting your enemies discover them before you discover theirs. That evening, back at the ranch, Ethan called a meeting with the 7 children. They gathered around the kitchen table, their faces ranging from curious to terrified. Rafe stood by the door, arms crossed, his expression grim. I'm not going to lie to you, Ethan began. There's a man in town who wants to take you away. He says he's going to place you with families, but the truth is he's going to sell you to factories back east. Places where children work 16-hour days until they can't work anymore. Maggie's face hardened. I knew it. I knew this was too good to last. Let me finish. Ethan held up his hand. He's going to try, but trying and succeeding are 2 different things. I've got friends in this territory, people who owe me favors. And I've got legal standing to keep you here as long as I can prove you're being properly cared for.
What if he brings the law? Danny asked. What if the sheriff comes?
Then we deal with the sheriff, one problem at a time.
The sheriff hates you. Noah's voice was flat. Everyone in town knows it. He'll side with Grayson just to hurt you. Probably. But hatred and legal authority aren't the same thing. Dalton can make trouble, but he can't just take you without cause. What about papers? Grace asked. Official documents giving you the right to keep us. That's exactly what I'm working on. I've sent word to a lawyer in Helena, a man named Warren, who's supposed to be good with custody cases. He's going to help us file for legal guardianship. All 7 of us? Bridget's voice was small and hopeful. All 7 of you. Properly documented. Legally protected. Ethan looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes. But I need something from you in return. What? Lily asked suspiciously.
I need you to trust me. Not blindly, not foolishly, but enough to let me handle this. I need you to stay together, stay on the ranch, and not do anything that gives Grayson or Dalton an excuse to separate you. The children exchanged glances. Silent communication passed between them, the kind that came from months of depending on each other for survival. Finally, Grace spoke. We'll trust you. But if you break that trust, if you give us any reason to think you're not who you say you are, we disappear. All of us together. Fair enough. And we want to help. Grace's gray eyes gleamed with determination. We're not just going to sit here and wait for someone to save us. We've been saving ourselves for too long to stop now. What did you have in mind? Information. Grayson isn't the only one who can ask questions. Bridget remembers everything she hears. Noah can read and write better than most adults. Danny knows how to move without being seen. And Lily has a way of making people underestimate her. We can be your eyes and ears in town. Ethan considered it. Every instinct screamed that he should protect these children, keep them safe on the ranch, handle the threat himself. But Grace was right. They weren't helpless victims waiting to be rescued. They were survivors who'd kept themselves alive against impossible odds. All right, he said, but carefully. No unnecessary risks, and everything you learn you bring straight to me. The children nodded, a new sense of purpose settling over them. They weren't just waiting to be saved anymore. They were fighting back. But that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Danny and Grace had an argument that revealed the fractures still present beneath their united front. We should run, Danny insisted, his voice low but fierce. Take the kids and disappear into the mountains before Grayson can make his move. Running means they win, Grace countered. It means we spend the rest of our lives hiding. Never safe, never settled. Better than ending up in a factory, is it? Grace's eyes flashed with anger Ethan had never seen from her before. I'm tired of running, Danny. Tired of being afraid. Mr. Cole is offering us something we've never had. A chance to actually stay somewhere, to actually belong. And what if he fails? What if Grayson wins? Then we fight, but we don't give up without trying. The other children, woken by the argument, gathered in the doorway. One by one, they weighed in. I vote we stay and fight, Lily said. If we run, we'll be running forever, Noah added. Mr. Cole stopped for us, Isaiah said quietly. We don't leave him. Anton nodded. My father always said a good man is not one who never falls, but one who keeps standing back up. Allie didn't speak, but she moved to stand beside Grace, her small hand slipping into the older girl's. Danny looked at all of them, these children he'd tried so hard to protect, and finally nodded. All right, we stay. But if things go wrong, we run fast and we run together. Agreed, Grace said. In the main house, Ethan heard none of this. He sat by the fire, Catherine's folder open in his lap, reading testimony from children who'd survived what Grayson was offering. The words made him sick, made him angry, made him more determined than ever to ensure that Grace and the others never experienced anything like it. Tomorrow he would ride to Helena, would hand this evidence to James Thornton, would do whatever it took to protect the family he was building from the ashes of the one he'd lost. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the ranch in white. And somewhere in Silver Creek, Silas Grayson was planning his next move, confident,
that a single rancher and 7 broken children couldn't possibly stand against an organization that had been trafficking children for decades.
He was about to learn how wrong he was. The morning of the 15th day dawned cold and clear. The kind of deceptive Montana winter morning where the sun shone bright but offered no warmth, where the sky stretched blue and endless while the thermometer read 20 below. Ethan stood on the porch, watching the children help Rafe with morning chores, their breath forming white clouds in the frozen air, their laughter carrying across the snow like music he'd forgotten existed. Grace limped between them with her makeshift crutch, no longer checking to make sure everyone was accounted for every few minutes. Danny worked at a reasonable pace instead of driving himself to exhaustion. Even Lily had started to smile occasionally, though she still watched Ethan with careful eyes that missed nothing. It felt like healing, like the slow thaw of winter giving way to something that might eventually become spring. That should have been his first warning. In Ethan's experience, peace never lasted long. "I need to ride to Helena," he told Rafe over breakfast. 70 miles. I should be back by tomorrow night." "The evidence?" Rafe asked quietly, glancing toward the children to make sure they weren't listening. Ethan nodded. Catherine had gotten word to him through Doc Weatherby. Federal prosecutor James Thornton was in Denver, but would be in Helena for 2 days only. If Ethan wanted to hand over the folder of evidence against Grayson's organization, this was his chance. Maybe his only chance. Grace looked up from her oatmeal, those 2 old eyes seeing straight through his casual tone to the worry underneath. "Something's wrong." "Just business," Ethan said. "Need to meet with the lawyer about making all this official. The guardianship papers." "You'll come back?" The question came out smaller than Grace probably intended, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "I promise." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "Rafe will be here." "You'll be safe." But Grace's expression remained troubled, her fingers tight around her spoon.
"I have a bad feeling." Ethan crouched down beside her chair.
"I give you my word I'll come back. Do you trust me?"
The silence stretched long enough that some of the other children looked up. Finally, Grace said, "I trust you." But her eyes couldn't hide the fear. 2 hours later, Ethan was riding Copper toward Helena, the folder of evidence tucked inside his coat, his mind already on the meeting with Thornton. He didn't look back at the ranch, didn't see Grace standing at the window, watching him disappear into the distance with the same expression a sailor's wife might wear, watching her husband's ship sail toward a storm. The riders came just after noon. Grace was helping Bridget with her letters when she heard the horses. 6 of them, moving fast, the sound of hoofbeats carrying across the frozen ground like distant thunder.
She looked up, her body tensing with an instinct born from too many months of learning that approaching strangers meant danger.
"Danny," she called. Her voice was calm but urgent. "Come here." The 14-year-old appeared from the barn, his face already worried. He'd heard the horses too. "Get everyone inside," Grace said. "Now." But Rafe was already moving toward the approaching riders, his rifle held loose but ready behind his back. Grace watched from the window as 6 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, their leader wearing a badge that caught the winter sunlight. Sheriff Marcus Dalton sat tall in his saddle, his face carrying the self-satisfied expression of a man who'd waited years for this moment. In his hand, he held a document that even from a distance looked official, complete with stamps and signatures. "Rafael Mendoza," Dalton called out. "By authority of the Territorial Court, I'm here to take custody of these children pending investigation into their welfare."
Rafe didn't move, didn't lower his rifle. "On what grounds, Sheriff?" "Concerns about living conditions. Reports of inadequate food, shelter, and supervision." Dalton's smile was cold as the wind.
The court has determined they'd be better served in the care of a proper institution while the investigation proceeds. What institution? Mr. Grayson's organization has generously offered to house them temporarily, all expenses paid, of course. Grace's blood turned to ice. She'd known this would happen. Had known from the moment Grayson visited that men with power and money and official papers wouldn't just let them go. Wouldn't let Ethan build something good without trying to tear it down. "Danny," she said quietly, "get the others ready to run. The cave, like Mr. Cole taught us." But before Danny could move, before Grace could even begin to execute their escape plan, one of Dalton's men pulled out a torch. The flame looked almost beautiful in the winter sunlight, orange and yellow dancing in the wind. Then he threw it. The hay barn erupted in flames so fast it seemed impossible, fire racing up the dry wood and leaping from beam to beam like something alive and hungry. Black smoke poured into the sky, visible for miles, a signal that something terrible was happening at the Cole ranch. Grace felt her heart stop. Not from fear for the barn, from fear for Alice. The 6-year-old stood in the doorway, frozen, her empty eyes suddenly filled with something Grace hadn't seen in weeks. Recognition. Memory. Terror so absolute it turned a child to stone. Alice had watched her family burn to death 6 weeks ago in a wagon train fire, had sat in the corner while her mother screamed and her father tried to break down the door and her 2 brothers cried and her baby sister went silent, had smelled the smoke and heard the crackling flames, and felt the heat that turned human beings into nothing but ash and bone. And now the fire was back. The sound that came from Alice's throat wasn't quite human. It was the sound of a soul breaking, of trauma buried so deep it had become part of the foundation finally cracking open and pouring out. She screamed. Not words, just pure, undiluted agony given voice. The scream was so primal, so utterly wrong coming from such a small body that even the 6 armed men took a step back. Their horses danced nervously, ears flat against their heads, sensing something in that scream that bypassed human understanding and went straight to instinct. The wagon burned at night. Mama woke me up screaming. Daddy tried to break the door, but it was stuck. Tommy and James were crying and crying, and baby Sarah just stopped making noise. And Mama's dress caught fire, and I could see her skin melting. And Daddy's hair was burning, and Tommy reached for me, but the flames were between us, and I couldn't get to him. And James was screaming for me to help, but I couldn't. I couldn't. I couldn't. The words poured out of Alice in a torrent. 6 weeks of silence breaking like a dam. Every horror she'd witnessed flooding out in a rush that left her gasping and shaking. Grace dropped to her knees, pulling Alice into her arms, even as the little girl continued to scream and sob, and finally speak. "It's okay," Grace said, her voice breaking. "It's okay. I'm here. I'm not leaving you." But Alice kept crying, kept talking, kept purging the memories that had locked her voice away. "And her family's gone, and everyone's gone, and the fire took them all, and now it's here again, and it's going to take you too." "Shut that child up," Dalton snapped. "This is official business." "She's terrified, you heartless bastard." Grace's fury burned hotter than the flames behind them. She watched her family burn to death. Fire is what killed them. And your man just set another fire. What did you think would happen? Not my concern. The court order is clear. These children are to be transferred to Mr. Grayson's custody immediately. And that's when Ethan Cole came thundering into the yard on a horse pushed to the edge of collapse. He'd been 10 miles out when he'd seen the smoke, had seen that black column rising into the clear blue sky, and known with absolute certainty that everything he'd feared was happening. had turned Copper around and ridden like hell itself was chasing him, pushing the mare harder than he'd ever pushed any horse, his mind filled with images of the children burning, of arriving too late, of failing to protect them the way he'd failed to protect Sarah and the boys.
He hit the ground before Copper had fully stopped, his chest heaving, his eyes taking in the scene with the speed of a man trained by war to assess threats instantly. The burning barn. The 6 armed men. Rafe held at gunpoint. 7 children huddled together with Alice screaming in Grace's arms, words finally pouring out of her after weeks of silence. And Marcus Dalton sitting on his horse with a court order and a smile. "On what grounds, Marcus?" Ethan's voice was deadly calm, the kind of quiet that came before violence. "Inadequate living conditions." Dalton gestured to the burning barn. "Fire hazard. Looks like we arrived just in time. One of your men threw that torch." "Prove it." Ethan took a step forward and 3 rifles swung toward him. He stopped, hands visible, mind racing through options. 6 armed men, 7 children, Rafe disarmed and helpless. The folder of evidence still tucked in his coat, useless against the immediate threat of guns and corrupt authority. But before he could speak, before he could make the gamble that might save them or get them all killed, another voice cut through the tension. "I have bank records," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the yard loud enough for everyone to hear. $20 a month deposited into an account in Helena under your name, Marcus. Payment from the Eastern Children's Placement Bureau. Want me to continue?" Something flickered across Dalton's face. Fear, quickly masked by anger. "That's a lie." "Is it? I've got testimony, evidence, a folder full of proof that you've been selling children for profit." He watched the 6 hired guns exchange uncertain glances. They'd signed up to intimidate a rancher and collect some orphans, not to be part of a scandal that could bring down the local sheriff. "How do you think the territorial governor will react when he sees it? How do you think the newspapers will react?" "He's bluffing," Dalton said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Try me." The standoff stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Alice's screams had faded to whimpers, muffled against Grace's shoulder. But she was still talking, still releasing years of pent-up trauma in broken sentences. The barn crackled and roared behind them, collapsing in on itself with sounds like breaking bones, and 24 people stood in the frozen yard, waiting to see who would move first. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "What in God's name is happening here?" Everyone turned to see Catherine Ashford riding up with 3 of her ranch hands, followed by Doc Weatherby in his worn buggy and Reverend Crane on horseback. Behind them came more townspeople, drawn by the smoke, arriving to find their sheriff holding children at gunpoint while a barn burned. "Mrs. Ashford." Dalton's attempt at authority sounded hollow. "This is sheriff's business, official business that involves burning down a man's barn and terrorizing children." Catherine dismounted, her 61 years evident in her movements, but her voice carrying steel that made men 40 years younger stand straighter. "I've known you for 20 years, Marcus Dalton. I knew you were petty, and I knew you held grudges, but I never thought you'd sink to child trafficking. I'm not trafficking anyone. I'm executing a court order. A court order obtained through fraud and bribery." Catherine pulled a folded paper from her coat. "I sent a telegram to Judge Morrison in Helena this morning explaining the situation. He's issued a stay on all custody transfers pending investigation. Your court order is worthless." Dalton's face went white. "You can't do that." "I just did. And I've also sent word to Federal Prosecutor Thornton in Denver." She looked at Ethan, something like respect in her ancient eyes. "He should be arriving by train within the week." "This isn't over," Dalton said.
but his voice was the voice of a defeated man who knew he'd overplayed his hand. "No, it isn't." Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a murmur only Dalton could hear. "But when it is over, you're going to wish you'd never touched these children. You're going to wish you'd stayed out of my way and let me raise them in peace. Because I'm going to destroy you, Marcus. Not with fists or guns, with the truth. And the truth is going to follow you for the rest of your miserable life." Dalton stared at him for a long moment, seeing something in Ethan's eyes that made him look away first. Then he mounted his horse and rode away without another word, his 6 hired guns following behind like the cowards they were. The barn was a total loss. The flames had consumed everything inside, including the winter hay supply and most of Ethan's tools. It would take months to rebuild, money he didn't have, time he couldn't spare. But none of that mattered, because the children were safe. All 7 of them, still huddled together, still watching him with eyes that had learned not to trust in permanence. Grace was the first to move. She limped toward him, still supporting Alice, who had finally gone quiet, her small body trembling with exhaustion from finally releasing what she'd been holding inside for so long. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now we put out what's left of that fire, and we figure out how to get through the rest of winter without a barn." Ethan looked at each child in turn, making sure they understood. "And we wait for the cavalry to arrive." "Cavalry?" Federal Prosecutor Thornton. Mrs. Ashford's evidence. The truth. He crouched down to Grace's level, his voice gentle. "Grayson isn't going to stop. Neither is Dalton. But now they're fighting on 2 fronts, and they don't even know it." The next few days passed in a strange limbo of waiting and recovery. Neighbors Ethan barely knew showed up with supplies, tools, offers of help. It turned out that Dalton wasn't as popular as he thought, and word of what he'd tried to do had spread through the territory like wildfire. Doc Weatherby came back the next day to check on the children, spending extra time with Alice. "She spoke," he told Ethan privately. "Not just sounds, but words. Complete sentences. That's enormous progress. The trauma broke through, which is painful, but sometimes pain is part of healing." "Will she be okay?" "I don't know. Trauma like hers takes years to heal, if it ever does." The old doctor sighed. "But she's better off here than in any institution I've ever seen. She's got people who care about her. That matters more than medicine sometimes." That night, Ethan found Alice sitting by the window, staring out at the ruins of the barn. The fire had been extinguished, but smoke still rose from the blackened timbers, visible even in the darkness. He sat down beside her, not speaking, just present. After a long moment, Alice turned to look at him. Her blue eyes, so empty for so long, held something new. Not quite awareness, not quite hope, but something. Then she did something that broke and healed Ethan's heart in the same moment. She reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his calloused palm, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. Ethan felt his throat tighten, felt tears burning behind his eyes that he hadn't let fall since Sarah died. "You're safe," he whispered. "Whatever happens, you're safe." Alice opened her mouth, and for a moment Ethan thought she might speak again. Instead, she simply squeezed his hand and leaned against his shoulder. In the doorway, Grace watched them, tears streaming down her face. For the first time since the cabin, she let herself cry. Not from fear or pain or exhaustion. From hope. From the terrifying, beautiful possibility that maybe, just maybe,
they'd found a place where broken things could heal. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the burned barn in white, making everything look clean and new. And somewhere in Silver Creek, Silas Grayson was planning his next move, unaware that federal forces were already closing in. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, Ethan believed they might actually win. 3 days after the fire, James Thornton arrived at the ranch with 2 U.S. Marshals flanking him like guards escorting something precious. He was younger than Ethan expected, maybe 36, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for taking down corrupt officials that stretched from Denver to Washington. He wore his authority the way some men wore guns, visible but not threatening unless you gave him reason. "Mr. Cole." Thornton shook Ethan's hand with a grip that spoke of quiet strength. "Mrs. Ashford speaks very highly of you. She's been fighting this battle longer than I have." Thornton's gaze moved past Ethan to where 7 children watched from the porch, their expressions ranging from hopeful to terrified. "And these are the children who survived hell." The words were simple, but the way he said them, with respect rather than pity, made Grace stand a little straighter, made Danny's shoulders lose some of their defensive tension, made even Lily's perpetual glare soften by a fraction. "I need to interview each of them," Thornton said. "Their testimony is crucial to building the case against Grayson and his organization. But I want your permission first. They've been through enough." Ethan's voice carried a warning. "I don't want them traumatized further." "Neither do I. I promise I'll be gentle, and they can stop at any time if it becomes too much." Thornton pulled a leather notebook from his coat. "I've done this before, Mr. Cole. I know how to talk to children who've been hurt." The interviews took 3 days, and each one felt like watching someone perform surgery without anesthetic. Necessary. Painful. The kind of thing that had to happen for healing to begin, but left scars nonetheless. Grace's interview lasted the longest. She sat across from Thornton at the kitchen table, her twisted legs stretched out beneath it, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that would have been impressive in an adult twice her age. Behind her calm exterior, Ethan could see the 11-year-old girl who'd kept 6 other children alive through sheer force of will. "Tell me about the wagon train," Thornton said, his pencil poised above his notebook. "They said we were slowing them down." Grace's voice was steady, factual, like she was reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "Said a crippled girl wasn't worth waiting for. That the weak would have to be left behind if the strong were going to survive." "Who said that?" "The wagon master, Mr. Henderson. He called a meeting on the 3rd night after people started getting sick. Said we needed to make hard choices." "What kind of choices?" "The kind where you decide which children are worth saving and which ones aren't." Grace's gray eyes met Thornton's without flinching. "I was in the first category they wanted to leave. Then Isaiah, because of his skin. Then Alice, after her family died and she stopped talking. Mr. Henderson said defective children would only drag everyone else down." The pencil in Thornton's hand had stopped moving. His jaw was tight, but his voice remained gentle. "What happened next?" Mrs. Thornton stood up. Sarah Thornton. She was a widow, no children of her own, nothing tying her to anyone. And she stood up in front of everyone and said if they were leaving children behind, she was staying with them. Grace's voice finally cracked, just slightly. She said she'd rather die with children who needed her than live with people who decided some lives weren't worth saving. "How long did you survive alone?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. We lost track of time. Grace listed the deaths matter-of-factly, like a general reciting casualties. Mr. Patterson froze in his sleep on day 12. His wife Mary died of fever on day 15.
Mrs. Thornton went for help on day 41. She made it 50 yards. And you kept the others alive all that time? Someone had to. Thornton set down his pencil, his professional mask slipping for just a moment. You're very brave, Miss Morgan. I'm not brave. Grace's hands tightened in her lap. I'm just tired of being scared. That's what bravery is. Being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway. Lily's interview was different. She sat with her arms crossed, her mixed heritage features set in an expression of hostile distrust that Thornton didn't try to break through with false friendliness. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, he said. Good, because I don't want to tell you anything.
Thornton nodded, accepting this.
Then let me tell you something instead. My mother was Chinese. Came to California during the gold rush, worked in the laundry for 15 years, died when I was 12. I know what it feels like to be judged for the blood in your veins. Lily's arms loosened slightly. You're like me? Enough like you to understand. Thornton leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of experience. They called my mother terrible things. Said she'd seduced my father with oriental tricks. Said I was an abomination that shouldn't exist. But my mother taught me something before she died. She said the people who hate you for what you are will always find reasons to justify their hatred. The trick is not letting their poison become your truth. They let my mama die. Lily's voice was small now, stripped of its defensive anger. When she got sick, nobody would help. Said it was God's punishment. They were wrong.
And helping me put Grayson in prison means no other child loses their mama the same way. Your testimony matters, Lily. She uncrossed her arms.
Tell me what you need.
But it was Isaiah's interview that revealed the deepest wounds.
The 7-year-old barely spoke at first, answering Thornton's questions with nods or single words. His distrust of authority ran too deep to overcome with gentle questions or shared experience. But then Thornton did something unexpected. He rolled up his sleeve. The scars ran from wrist to elbow, old marks that had healed badly, the kind left by shackles worn too long, by skin too young. You see these? Thornton's voice was quiet. I got them when I was about your age. From a man who thought he owned me because he owned my mother. Isaiah stared at the scars, his ancient eyes going wide. You were a slave. My mother was. I was born free, technically. But freedom didn't mean much when the wrong people decided it shouldn't.
Thornton rolled his sleeve back down.
I became a prosecutor because I wanted to put men like that in prison. Men who think they can buy and sell human beings. Men like Grayson. Can you really stop them? I can try. But I need your help. I need you to tell me what you saw, what you heard. Your voice matters, Isaiah. More than you know. For the first time since Ethan had found him, Isaiah talked. Really talked. About the fear. About the running. About the endless uncertainty of never knowing if today was the day someone would decide you weren't worth keeping. But then he said something that made everyone in the room go still. They didn't die from sickness. Not really. Thornton stopped writing. What do you mean? My mama and daddy. People say they got sick, but that's not what killed them. Isaiah's voice was hollow, empty of everything except truth. They wouldn't sell their land to a white man. Said they'd been freed. Said the land was theirs, legal and proper.
His small hands clenched into fists.
Men came at night. Riders with their faces covered. I hid under the floorboards like Mama taught me. Heard Daddy yelling. Heard Mama crying. When they left, Both my parents were dead. The silence that followed felt like the weight of the world pressing down. Thornton's hand trembled slightly as he wrote, his professional composure finally cracking. They called it robbery, Isaiah continued. But I know the truth. I know what I heard. I can't bring your parents back. Thornton's voice was thick with emotion. But I can make sure men like Grayson, men who think they can buy and sell people, never hurt you or anyone else again. You really mean that? I give you my word. 6 weeks later, the trial began in Helena. The courthouse was packed with spectators drawn by rumors of child trafficking and corrupt sheriffs, by whispers of children left to die and officials bought with blood money. Silas Grayson sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, his face carrying the confidence of a man who'd won every legal battle he'd ever fought. His lawyer, Benjamin Sterling, was a legend in Montana Territory. 60 years old with silver hair and a reputation for getting railroad barons acquitted of murder. He wore his success like armor. The first 2 days were devoted to evidence. Thornton presented Catherine's meticulous records, financial documents showing Grayson had made over $60,000 in 5 years. Bank statements proving Sheriff Dalton had received regular payments. Contracts with factories that spelled out prices per child based on age, strength, and ability. $50 for a healthy boy over 10, $30 for a girl, $20 for anyone with defects or difficulties. The jury, 12 men ranging from farmers to merchants, listened with expressions that ranged from disgust to skepticism.
Ethan, sitting in the gallery with 7 children pressed close against him, watched their faces and tried to gauge which way the verdict might fall. Days 3 and 4 brought testimony from survivors. A 9-year-old boy who'd lost 3 fingers in a textile machine. An 11-year-old girl who showed the jury scars from beatings administered when she worked too slowly. A 7-year-old who hadn't seen sunlight for 9 months while working in a coal mine. Each story was worse than the last. Each child carried trauma that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But Sterling was good at his job. Very good. During cross-examination, a detail emerged that made the case more complex. Sterling called a witness, a factory foreman who testified that Silas Grayson himself had been an orphan, placed in a textile mill at age 8. He'd worked his way up from child laborer to recruiter, genuinely believing he was offering children the same opportunity he'd received. He started with nothing, the foreman said. Mr. Grayson gave these children the same chance he had, a chance to work, to learn a trade, to become self-sufficient. It didn't excuse his crimes, but it explained them. Grayson had internalized the system that exploited him, then perpetuated it, convinced he was helping. This revelation didn't soften the jury. If anything, it made Grayson's guilt more damning. He'd known exactly what he was sending children into because he'd lived it himself, and he'd done it anyway. My client provides opportunities, Sterling told the jury during his closing argument on day 5. These children would starve without intervention. Would the court prefer they die on the frontier rather than work in civilization? He made it sound reasonable, made exploitation sound like salvation, made slavery by another name sound like charity. Ethan watched the jury and felt hope beginning to die. They were nodding along with Sterling's logic, starting to see Grayson not as a monster, but as a businessman making hard choices in a hard world. Grace felt it too. She leaned close to Ethan and whispered, "We're going to lose, aren't we?" He wanted to lie. Wanted to tell her that justice would prevail and good would triumph and everything would work out fine. But she'd asked for truth, and she deserved truth. "I don't know," he said. That afternoon, Sterling gave his closing argument. "Gentlemen of the jury, you and I both know the world isn't perfect.
Orphans are a reality of frontier life. My client doesn't create that problem. He provides a solution. He paused, letting his words sink in. Is it ideal? No. But is it better than leaving children to freeze in abandoned cabins? Is it better than watching them starve in the streets? You decide. It was a masterful performance. Even Ethan, who knew the truth, felt the pull of Sterling's logic. Then Thornton stood. I have one final witness. Grace Morgan.
The courtroom went silent as Grace limped to the witness stand, using her crutch to navigate the 3 steps up to the chair. She looked impossibly small sitting there, a child testifying against men who'd built empires on suffering. The judge looked down at her with something like pity. You don't have to stand if it's difficult, child. I've stood through harder things than this, Your Honor. Thornton approached slowly, giving her time to settle. Miss Morgan, can you tell the jury what Mr. Grayson said when he came to the ranch? He said some of us were unusual. Grace's voice was clear, carrying to every corner of the crowded room. A mixed-race girl, a colored boy, a cripple. Those were his words. And what did he mean by that? He meant we were hard to place with families, that we'd end up in less desirable situations. Grace paused, then looked directly at the jury. He meant we weren't good enough to be loved, just good enough to work until we died. Objection, Sterling called out. Speculation. Sustained, the judge said. But Grace wasn't done. You want to know the difference between Mr. Grayson and Mr. Cole? She didn't wait for permission to continue. Mr. Grayson looked at us and saw a profit. $50 per child, more for the healthy ones. Her gray eyes swept across the jury, making contact with each man. Mr. Cole looked at us and saw people. He saw Grace, not the cripple. He saw Lily, not the half-breed. He saw Isaiah, not the colored boy. Tears started streaming down her face, but her voice never wavered. He was the first person who didn't abandon us. The first person who told us we weren't broken, just hurt. That there's a difference. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Sterling seemed at a loss for words. He didn't save us out of obligation. Grace's voice cracked with emotion. He did it because of love. And that's what Mr. Grayson will never understand. Love can't be bought, can't be sold. Never. She turned to look at Ethan in the gallery, tears flowing freely now. I love you, Papa. All of us do. And then Alice stood up, the 6-year-old who hadn't spoken for 7 weeks until fire forced the words out. She stood up in the courtroom gallery, and her voice, small but clear, cut through the silence like a bell. Papa. Then louder, more certain. Papa! She pushed past the others and ran toward Ethan with the desperate urgency of a child who'd learned that the people you love can disappear at any moment. He met her at the rail, dropping to his knees as she crashed into him, her small arms wrapping around his neck with fierce determination. The other 6 children followed, Danny and Lily and Noah and Anton and Bridget and Isaiah, all of them surrounding Ethan in a crush of bodies and tears and desperate affection. All of them holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to tear them apart. The entire courtroom watched in absolute silence. Several jurors were openly crying. Even the judge had to look away, his hand coming up to wipe at his eyes. Thornton stood at the witness stand, his throat working as he tried to speak. No further questions, Your Honor. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, their foreman, a farmer named John Wheeler, who'd seemed sympathetic to Sterling's arguments, stood with red-rimmed eyes. On the charge of child trafficking, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty.
on the charge of conspiracy. Guilty. Grayson's face went white as the list continued. Every single charge. Guilty. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Sheriff Marcus Dalton, tried separately but simultaneously, received 15 years and forfeiture of all property. "It's over," Grace whispered that night as they rode back to the ranch. "Really over. The legal part," Ethan said. "The rest takes longer."
But for the first time since he'd found them freezing in that cabin, all 7 children looked like they believed tomorrow might actually come.
Spring came slowly to Montana that year, the snow melting in reluctant patches that revealed brown grass and mud beneath. But when it finally arrived in earnest, it transformed the ranch from a place of survival into something that almost resembled hope. The children threw themselves into rebuilding what the fire had destroyed, their laughter echoing across the valley as they worked alongside neighbors who'd once been strangers. Danny organized the work crews with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. Lily discovered she had a gift for carpentry that surprised everyone, including herself. Even little Alice, still speaking sparingly, but speaking nonetheless, helped by carrying tools and fetching water, her small hands finally doing something other than trembling.
The new barn went up in 3 weeks, built with lumber donated by families across the territory, and labor provided by men who'd heard about the trial and wanted to be part of something good. People Ethan had never met showed up with hammers and saws, drawn by a story that had spread far beyond Silver Creek.
"Didn't know you had so many friends," Rafe observed one evening, watching the last of the volunteers ride away. "Neither did I. They're not here for you, Hefe. They're here for the children, for what they represent." "What do they represent?" Rafe smiled, his weathered face creasing with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite name. Hope. The idea that even in a hard world, good things can happen. That strangers can become family. That broken things can be mended. The guardianship papers arrived in June, thick documents covered in official seals and signatures that made everything legal. Made what had been built on promises and desperate circumstances into something the law recognized.
Ethan signed them at the kitchen table, with Grace standing beside him, watching each stroke of the pen like it was a sacred ritual.
"It's real now," she said when he finished. "Legal. Permanent."
"It was always real, Grace. The papers just make it official."
"No. Before it was just promises, words that could be broken." She touched the documents with something close to reverence. "This is different. This means something."
"What does it mean to you?"
"It means I can finally stop waiting for everything to fall apart. Stop expecting you to change your mind or get tired of us or decide we're too much trouble." Grace's gray eyes, so old in such a young face, met his. "It means I can start believing in tomorrow." But there was one more thing Ethan wanted to do, something he'd been thinking about since the trial ended. "There's something else," he said, pulling out another set of documents from the envelope. "I want to officially adopt all of you. Not just guardianship. Real family."
The kitchen went silent. 7 children stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to desperate hope. "Your names would be Whitfield, Grace Whitfield, Daniel Whitfield, Lily Whitfield. All of you." Ethan looked at each child in turn. "If you want it, if you'll have me." Danny was the first to move, stepping forward with tears already streaming down his face.
"Yes."
His voice cracked on the word.
"Yes. I want that."
Then Lily, her perpetual suspicion finally giving way to something that looked like joy.
"I want it too." One by one they agreed. Noah and Anton and Bridget and Isaiah, each one stepping forward to claim a name that meant belonging, that meant someone had chosen them not out of obligation, but out of love. Alice was last. She stood holding the pen, looking at the line where her signature should go. "I don't know how to write it," she said quietly, her voice still unused to forming words after so many weeks of silence.
"Let Papa help you," Ethan said, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite contain. He took her small hand in his, guided the pen across the paper in careful letters. Alice Morgan Whitfield. The name of a girl who'd survived fire and loss and silence to find her voice again. When it was done, when all 7 signatures had been added to the documents, Grace looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "We're really a family now, aren't we?" "We always were," Ethan said. "But now the whole world knows it." December came around again, marking 1 full year since Ethan had found them in that frozen cabin. The anniversary fell on a day much like that first one, cold and clear with snow drifting down in lazy spirals. Grace stood on the porch beside Ethan, both of them wrapped in heavy coats against the Montana winter. "1 year ago today you found us," she said. "1 year since everything changed." "Feels longer. Feels shorter, too. Both at the same time." Grace pulled her coat tighter, but not against the cold, against memory. "I've been thinking about the future. I mean, now that I'm allowed to think about tomorrow without being afraid it won't come." "What did you decide?" "I want to teach, like my father did. But not just reading and writing." She turned to face him, her expression fierce with purpose. "I want to teach children who've been through what we went through. Show them they're not broken. Help them find their voices the way you helped us find ours." "That's a beautiful dream, Grace." "It's not a dream anymore. It's a plan." Catherine Ashford had already made the arrangements, paid the tuition, written the letters of recommendation. "There's a normal school in Denver that trains teachers. Mrs. Ashford thinks I could be ready in 2 years, maybe less." "Denver's a long way from here." "I know." Grace's voice wavered slightly. "But I'll come back. This is home. Your home. No matter where I go or what I do, that won't change." Ethan felt his chest tighten with pride so fierce it almost hurt. This girl who'd been left to die on a frozen mountainside, who'd protected 6 other children through sheer force of will, who taught him what family really meant. She was going to change the world. "I'm proud of you," he said. "More proud than I know how to say." "I know." Grace smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her too-old face into something that looked almost like childhood. "I'm proud of me, too." Finally, the other children were finding their paths as well. Danny had become Ethan's right hand, managing the daily operations of the ranch with the same dedication he'd once poured into self-destruction. But now his work came from purpose rather than guilt. He'd started training horses, showing a gift for gentling even the wildest mustangs with patience instead of force. "You could make a living at this," Ethan told him one afternoon, watching the 15-year-old work with a mare that had thrown 3 previous riders. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll stay here, help you run this place." Danny stroked the horse's neck, his movements sure and calm. "Build something that lasts. Help other kids the way you helped us." Lily had declared her intention to become a lawyer like James Thornton, though her path would be harder than most. Harvard Law was a dream that seemed impossible for a 13-year-old mixed-race girl in Montana territory. But Catherine was already pulling strings, writing letters, opening doors that had been closed to people like Lily since the country was founded. "I'm going to fight for them," Lily told Ethan one evening, her dark eyes burning with determination.
All the children nobody wants. All the people everyone thinks are less than. I'm going to make the law protect them the way it protected us.
Noah had filled 3 journals with observations and stories and questions that had no easy answers. His faith hadn't returned, but his anger had transformed into something more useful. Something that looked like purpose. Someone needs to write down what happened, he explained when Ethan asked about the endless scribbling. Someone needs to make sure people remember. Not just us, but all the children who didn't get found. The ones who disappeared into factories and never came out. Why you? Because I survived. Because I can. Noah's voice steadied with conviction. My father used to say bearing witness was sacred work. I thought he meant witnessing for God. But maybe he meant something bigger. Making sure the truth doesn't get lost. Anton remained the heart of the group, his cheerful nature no longer a mask, but genuine joy slowly replacing artificial happiness. He'd apprenticed himself to a Polish baker in Silver Creek, learning to make bread the way his father had taught him before sickness took everything. Bridget was writing stories, creating illustrated books by hand that captured the magic and terror of their journey. Catherine had connections with a printing house in Boston and had already sent samples of the girls' work east. The response had been encouraging. Isaiah worked with the horses alongside Danny, finding peace in the simple rhythm of caring for animals who asked nothing but kindness. His distrust had faded slowly, replaced by something that looked like belonging. He'd even started talking about buying land of his own someday, becoming the kind of man his parents had died trying to be. And Alice, the silent girl who'd found her voice in fire and courtroom both, had discovered she could speak in ways beyond words. She drew pictures that made people weep. Images of children surviving impossible odds, of strangers becoming family, of love found in the darkest places. By the summer of 1879, 18 months after Ethan had pulled them from that frozen cabin, the ranch had transformed into something none of them had imagined. Catherine's influence and resources had helped establish it officially as Coal Haven for Children. 11 orphans now called it home, the original 7 plus 4 newcomers who'd arrived with their own stories of loss and abandonment. Rafe managed the daily operations with the help of Danny and some hired hands from town. Ethan taught survival skills, riding, everything he'd learned during his years on the frontier. And the children, both old and new, learned that family was something you built, rather than something you were born into. In the fall, Grace left for Denver. The entire household turned out to see her off. 11 children ranging from 6 to 16 years old, all of them crowding around the wagon that would take her to the train station. Alice gave her a drawing, a picture of Grace teaching a classroom full of children who all looked different, all looked broken in various ways. All looked loved. "Don't forget us," Bridget said, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "Never." Grace hugged each of them in turn, saving Ethan for last. "I'll write every week, I promise. I know you will." Ethan held her for a long moment, this child who'd become his daughter in every way that mattered. "Make us proud." "I will." She pulled back, tears streaming down her face, but her expression determined. "And I'll come back. This is home." The night before she left, they'd sat on the porch one last time, watching the sun set over the Montana hills that had witnessed so much pain and healing. "I told my students in Denver about you," Grace said. "About the man who stopped on a frozen road and changed everything. I hope you didn't make me sound too heroic. I told them the truth, that you were stubborn and scared and had no idea what you were doing." Grace smiled through her tears. "And that you did it anyway. That's the part that matters." 23 years passed.
Ethan Cole Whitfield, now 61 years old with more silver than brown in his hair, sat on the same porch where he'd made so many promises. The ranch had changed over the years, expanded and evolved, but the core remained the same. Cole Haven for Children had operated for 25 years, providing shelter for 289 orphaned children. Some had stayed for months, others for years. A few had returned as adults to help run the place, passing forward the grace they'd received.
The original 7 came back every summer without fail, bringing spouses and children of their own, filling the ranch with the kind of noise Ethan had thought he'd never hear again after Sarah and the boys died. Grace Whitfield, now 36, had become Montana's first female school principal in 1895. She'd opened 3 schools specifically for children the system called defective or difficult, children like she'd once been. She visited the ranch twice a year, always staying in her old room, always checking on the current residents to make sure they knew they mattered. Danny had never left. At 39, he still ran the horse training program that had become famous across 3 territories. His methods, built on patience and respect rather than dominance, would be taught in ranching schools for decades to come. He'd married a school teacher from Silver Creek and had 4 children who treated Ethan like their grandfather. Lily Chen Whitfield had made it to Harvard Law in 1885, one of the first women of color to attend. She hadn't become a famous lawyer. The path had been too difficult. Too many doors remained closed. But she'd become a paralegal who spent her life fighting for labor reforms and child protection laws. Her work had changed legislation in 7 states. Noah's book,